Scott Ritter is a respected independent commentator on international relations and conflicts. He previously worked as a United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq, where he controversially challenged American and British claims about alleged weapons of mass destruction, claims that were used to justify the 2003 Gulf War, but which were later exposed as fabrications and lies. Scott Ritter, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Can I just ask you, what do you make of reports this week that the United States is conducting back-channel talks with Russia on avoiding a nuclear escalation? Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to the White House, has claimed that channels are open with his Russian counterpart, Nikolai Patrushev. Now, is this a de facto recognition by the United States that it needs to seriously engage with Russia because, as Moscow has repeatedly warned, the war in Ukraine is creating dangerous risks of an uncontrollable, catastrophic conflict?
Look, the back channel diplomatic means has been a feature of U.S.-Soviet, U.S.-Russian relations since the time of John F. Kennedy. The back channel was famously used by Robert Kennedy, John's brother, who was Attorney General at the time, to communicate with Soviet officials in an unofficial capacity in order to make sure that there was a dialogue and that certain options could be discussed that otherwise might not be able to be discussed. And it contributed to the peaceful outcome, the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And since that time, I believe every American president has availed himself of the back channel. When we speak of today, you know, the irony is, while Jake Sullivan may have discussed the back channel, he's probably not the one conducting it. It's probably being conducted by somebody who actually wrote a book called The Back Channel. And that would be William Burns, former U.S. State Department official, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, and currently the director of the CIA. Many people feel that Joe Biden picked William Burns to be his CIA director, not because he wanted him to be a master intelligence operative or manager, but because he wanted to avail himself of the back channel diplomacy that Burns has shown himself to be a master at carrying out. And so I would imagine that Burns is the person taking the lead on this back channel diplomacy. And the purpose of it is, as you said, neither the United States nor Russia wants or is seeking a nuclear conflict. I think both parties understand what's going on in Ukraine is very serious. They both take diametrically opposed points of view to this crisis, and it's still questionable whether or not, you know, a satisfactory, peaceful resolution can be met, or is the only solution a decisive victory by one party or the other. Regardless, both parties understand that they cannot and will not allow this to spin out of control, so that nuclear weapons become, you know, part of the toolbox being used by either side. And the back channel is that means. It's being used to do that. Outside of the attention of the media, outside of the pressures of politics, just one official talking with another, clearing the air, and then they go back and report in private to their respective leadership.
Although, Scott, you know, the reported US concern about a nuclear escalation and to avoid it seems to be an absurd contradiction, given that the United States is massively arming, you know, a very anti-Russian Kiev regime, and the United States is fueling a war, a serious war on Russia's doorstep. So, you know, would you agree that there seems to be a deplorable disconnect in Washington's position?
Well, I think there's been a disconnect in Washington's position for some time now, dating back to the decision to facilitate a coup against former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych in February of 2014 in Kiev, the Maidan affair. And since that time, the United States has been acting in an extraordinarily provocative fashion, putting U.S. military personnel on the soil in Ukraine whose sole purpose is to train the Ukrainian army so that they can more efficiently kill Russian or pro-Russian separatists who are fighting in the Donbass. The United States purposefully suppressed any realistic effort to implement the Minsk Accords because the United States was part of this scam that former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko spoke of regarding the Minsk agreements, that they were never intended to be fulfilled. They were always designed simply to buy time for NATO to train a Ukrainian army capable of forcefully taking over the Donbass. And the United States has embraced a policy of seeking to undermine and weaken Russia by stripping Ukraine away from its sphere of influence. That's been a strategic objective of the United States for many years now. So the United States has behaved in a deplorable fashion, very aggressive fashion that underwrites a policy which, if taken to its extremes, could lead to a nuclear conflict between the United States and Russia. So it's somewhat absurd for the United States now to be wagging an accusatory finger at the Russians, saying, "Shame on you for daring to mention the term nuclear," when the United States is behaving in such a grossly irresponsible fashion. Plus, remind you, Russia hasn't been throwing around the term nuclear. The term has been used more by the West and by NATO than it has by Russia, and by the West and NATO in an entirely speculative fashion, misrepresenting Russian doctrine and the statements by Russian leadership. So one has to question who's really this power seeking to turn this into a nuclear conflict, because I don't think it's Russia.
Yeah. You mentioned it earlier on, Scott, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and comparisons have been made to that crisis in October 1962. Do you see the present tensions between the United States and Russia as being as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, that's like me saying, comparing a knife fight that took place many years ago with a machine gun battle that's taking place today. Which one do I see as more dangerous? I see the machine gun battle is more dangerous because it can kill far more people. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as serious as it was, neither side had the nuclear arsenal in place that could destroy the other. They could destroy cities. They could create tremendous harm. But I mean, the Russians had, 4 or 6 intercontinental ballistic missiles. The United States had a handful. There were some submarine missiles, but by and large, we didn't have nation-killing capacity at that time. We have that today. So while the consequences of a nuclear conflict in 1962 would have been very serious, I don't mean to minimize it at all, it wouldn't have been world-ending. The consequences of a nuclear crisis today are world-ending. We have thousands of nuclear weapons on each side. If these weapons are used to their full capacity, nothing will survive on this planet. Maybe some cockroaches will, but no humans and no air-breathing mammals. The world will end as we know it. And so that makes the current situation far more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And there seemed to be better diplomatic skills in Washington back then. Also, ideologically, more respect for their adversary. I mean, today Washington seems to have a very hubristic, self-righteous view of itself, which leaves the room for negotiations or diplomacy very marginal, very reduced.
Look, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was just once removed from Joseph Stalin. And I don't think there's anybody who will say that Joseph Stalin was the servant boy of the Americans or the British. I don't think anybody will ever say that. History shows it's just not the case. Regardless of what we thought of Joseph Stalin, we respected him largely because we feared him. And Nikita Khrushchev was the next in line. He still was at the head of a Soviet Union that, while we had somewhat more normalized relations with, we still feared them. We still respected them. Today, we are in a situation where we forgot to respect how to respect Russia. The decade of the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet Union was one where the United States and Europe and others um, economically exploited Russia. We viewed Russia as a defeated enemy. We went in and we bought presidency. We bought a presidency. Boris Yeltsin was our president, bought and paid for. We bragged about how we won the 1996 re-election for him simply by throwing money at it. We stole an election, and we think it's the greatest thing in the world. We wanted Russia weak. We didn't take Russia seriously. That's why we allowed all these arms control treaties to lapse. And now we have a situation where Vladimir Putin has sought to right the ship, the Russian ship, try to restore Russia to where he believes it should be in the international scheme of things. And we in the West take umbrage at this. How dare you, Russia, stand up on your own 2 feet? Why didn't you ask us permission first? How dare you wear clothes that you find acceptable? You should wear the garments we alone allow you to wear. We want to dictate everything to Russia, and we're very unhappy that Russia refuses to play this game. We have to learn, tragically, to become afraid of Russia, because only from that fear will there emerge the respect that's necessary for the kind of meaningful improvement in relations that took place in the 1970s and 80s prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, that would tend to emphasize then why the present situation is quite dangerous, very dangerous, because the mindset in Washington does not seem to be, up for the task of negotiating a proper détente or, security agreement with Russia. Whereas in JFK's time, there seemed to be a healthy respect or a healthy fear of the adversary.
One of the things that people forget in terms of history is the Berlin Wall and the Berlin crisis. There was a period of time where Khrushchev was trying to force JFK. There was a meeting in Vienna, the first summit between JFK and Khrushchev, and it didn't go well for JFK. He came off very poorly in this summit. And at that time, the Russians were putting pressure on the United States for a peace treaty in Germany. People tend to forget that after Nazi Germany was defeated and occupied, that there was supposed to be a peace treaty. Peace treaty actually wasn't finalized, I believe, until 1990, when German reunification came after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But the Russians were seeking a peace treaty because they said only then can we have normalized relations with Germany. But the United States didn't want a peace treaty because we enjoyed having Europe split, and it enabled us to empower West Germany by making them a member of NATO, putting troops in there, et cetera. But there was talk, what would happen if the Russians went into Berlin? And people at that time said, there's really not much we can do. We might have to sacrifice Berlin because we're not willing to go to general nuclear war over Berlin. And the reason why I bring that up is when people think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis stuff, they think of American strength. But, American strength isn't absolute, never has been. And there are times when America is called upon to accept a temporary defeat in an effort to achieve an overall objective. And the reason why I bring that up is we're looking at Ukraine right now. Ukraine is a situation that the United States ultimately can't win, in my opinion. It's too resource intensive. The Ukrainians just simply don't have the depth in terms of economic strength, political strength, and the military strength to prevail in a war with Russia. And now the question is, when is the United States going to realize this? At what point will the United States understand that Ukraine is a lost cause and that we need to let it go and we need to consolidate around that which is truly important to us, which would, of course, be the NATO alliance? We haven't reached that point yet, but I do believe that point is coming. I do believe that the economic pain being felt by Europe, combined with the new political reality that may be emerging here in the United States post midterm elections, will lead the United States to seek a graceful exit from Ukraine, tragically at the expense of the Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian people.
Well, can I just go to a bigger picture issue, and that's on the possibility of a preemptive use of nuclear weapons. The United States refuses to explicitly renounce a first use option. By contrast, Russia and China categorically state that their nuclear arsenals are for a solely defensive and therefore a solely deterrence purpose. Now, you've recently described the US nuclear posture as, quote, holding the world to ransom and, quote again, blackmailing the world from its from its deliberate ambiguity about the use of its nuclear arsenal. Now, can I put it to you, does this US posture of ambiguity amount to nuclear terrorism?
You get a lawyer to answer that question. I mean, I will tell you that if you're threatening the use of nuclear weapons, that is terroristic activity. In the United States, we have a crime, which is basically to threaten terrorism. If I go up to you and I threaten to punch you in the face and scream and all that, terroristic threats is the crime. You don't have to actually carry it out. You just have to make the threat. You can be arrested and prosecuted. And the United States is basically, by continuing this policy. Remember, this policy wasn't invented by the Biden administration. It came into initial fruition during the time of George W. Bush after 9/11, when the United States made a decision that it was no longer going to allow its hands to be tied by, arms control treaties and nuclear postures designed to minimize the possibility of nuclear war. We invested heavily in this nuclear arsenal, and therefore we must be able to get something from this investment. And then the thing we were going to get isn't just nuclear deterrence, meaning you attack me, I attack you, the world ends, therefore you will never attack me, I will never attack you. It was to invoke what I call is sort of the Richard Nixon type madman theory, because Richard Nixon famously or infamously, depending on your point of view, wanted the North Vietnamese to believe that he was insane, that he was literally a madman who was so unstable that he could drop a nuclear bomb at any time. So you better go to the peace table or I might nuke you. That was his whole approach. And it seems that that's the approach we've taken, not with so much drama, but by walking away from the sole use theory, which is the sole use theory is the sole purpose of the United States nuclear arsenal is deterrence against other nations attacking. Joe Biden actually ran on a platform promising to implement the sole purpose doctrine. He lied. He failed because what he did is continue the Bush administration policy, which Barack Obama also said he wanted to end that. He wanted to go to sole purpose, but he didn't. He had 8 years to do so. He didn't. It shows you the power of the American nuclear establishment as a lobbying group where they could play on your fears. And the fears that they play on is if we go to purely nuclear deterrence, we're freeing up the hands of our potential opponents. We're allowing them to do things they might not otherwise do if we threaten the use of nuclear weapons preemptively in a non-nuclear environment. We want to have this deliberately ambiguous approach so that nobody dares attack us because they just don't know what our red line is. What would trigger an American nuclear response? We don't know. Therefore, we shouldn't do anything against America. That's holding the world hostage. That's nuclear blackmail. That's terroristic threats, in my opinion. Again, a lawyer might come up to me and say, "No, you're wrong. Here's the legal reasons why." But as a layman, I'll just say that I view anybody who threatens the use of nuclear weapons without a clear definition of when we would use it under these precise conditions. Anything less than that, it's blackmail. Either do what we tell you to do, or we might nuke you. Yeah. You'll never know.
Yeah. I mean, I would guess that it would have a transformative effect if the United States were to align its posture with Russia and China, in that, just specifying that sole purpose use of deterrence. That would have a transformative effect in international relations, lowering tensions, etc. Would you agree?
Yes, and it also is just the only sane thing to do. Look, I just find it strange that the five declared nuclear powers, we know there's more, but the five declared, um, you know, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, have all come together and as recently as earlier this year and said nuclear wars cannot be won, therefore they should never be fought.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fantastic statement. But the next thing after that is if nuclear wars cannot be won and should never be fought, then why do we have nuclear weapons? And I think that's the question that needs to be answered by everybody. And the proper answer is we shouldn't. We shouldn't. But you see, you can't go down that path if you have this expansive nuclear posture of the United States, because now the answer is, well, we have it not just because of nuclear war. We're deterring biological war against us, chemical war, cyber attacks. We're deterring anything. We don't like the color of your mother's dress. We don't like the tone of your father's voice. We will nuke you, nuke you, nuke you, nuke you, because we're America. And we are the world's supreme power. No one dares challenge us. And if you do, like Richard Nixon, we may nuke you because we're just crazy enough to do it. That's a grossly irresponsible policy. The only way towards nuclear disarmament is for the United States to adopt sole purpose.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like the US is a hostage of its own propaganda narrative. You know, its policy making is a hostage to its, you know, false depiction of the world of a dangerous place where there's lots of enemies. When you paint the world like that, it's very hard to change policy, isn't it? Isn't that what you're saying?
Yes, you're 100% correct on the policy. First of all, when you paint yourself as the singular power in the world around which all else must rotate, I mean, we are the center of the universe, the United States, and the world must rotate around us as we determine. Therefore, if you have this much responsibility, you need extraordinary power to manage the minions. You have to manage the minions and keep them rotating the way you want them to rotate. And the nuclear weapon gives us that, at least theoretically, gives that. That it's a stupid way of thinking because we don't have absolute power. There's other nuclear powers out there, Russia, that can wipe us off the face of the earth, just like we can wipe them off the face of the earth. So there's that. But here's the other thing that's more important than just the politics of it, geopolitics of it. It's the economics of it. You see, our nuclear enterprise is a multi-billion-dollar scam being run on the American people, where we spend all this money on producing weapons that if we ever use, it's the end of the United States. And yet we continue to justify the expenditure. And it's been spread loaded such that we have senators and congressmen who are elected to Congress solely to continue the nuclear enterprise because their districts or their states have been empowered with this. In New Mexico, you cannot be a state senator of New Mexico unless you support the nuclear weapons complex and enterprise because Sandia National Labs and Los Alamos is there. You can't be a senator from Texas or from the state of Tennessee without likewise buying into the nuclear powered complex. And the same thing with certain members of Congress. So there is a permanent nuclear constituency here in the United States that's linked to money because this billions of dollars that are spent in these districts, basically underwriting high paying jobs, a good tax base. They attract intellectuals. There's educational institutions built around this. It has spin-off capabilities. Sandia isn't just involved in nuclear weapons, they're involved in everything. The same with Los Alamos. So these are national security enterprises. And it's impossible to walk away from this. It's an addiction. We have basically made certain states and congressional districts addicted to the money that's linked to nuclear weapons, and they can't break that addiction. They won't break that addiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kind of leads us to my last question, Scott, and thank you very much for your time and insights. My last question is this: what would it take for the United States to adopt normal, cooperative, peaceful relations with other powers, in particular Russia and China? This week we've had elections in the US. Yet belligerent policy doesn't seem to change from one administration to the next, regardless of whether the administration is Republican or Democrat. So, what needs to change to create more peaceful international relations from the United States?
I mean, unfortunately, it's not going to be easy. Let's put it this way: the American people are creatures of comfort. We're a consumer-driven society, and as long as our politicians keep us wrapped in a cocoon of comfort, we don't want to rock the boat. So, Democrats and Republicans have learned this. And so, even though a Democrat believes in this and a Republican believes in that, at the end of the day, they both believe in staying in power, which means they need the vote of the American cocoon. And they're going to just keep wrapping silk around us, keeping us happy. And you do that by oversimplifying things. You do that by distracting. You don't want the cocoon to think too much, because the caterpillar in the cocoon might do his way out, look around, say, hey, there's a world out there. I choose to fly. Can't have that. So the American voter is kept a prisoner in a cocoon of comfort and a cocoon of ignorance. And a large part of this ignorance is fear-based. We're trained from the very beginning. Just a second. Too much talking today. This is God's way of telling me to shut up. But we're trained to, from a very early age, to fear the Russians and fear the Chinese, or in this case, to disrespect both. But in no case can we view them as friendly partners. I mean, the Chinese are, it's communist all the way, baby. Even today, all we got the communist China, communist China, communist China, communist China. It hasn't changed at all. The Russians, they went from being communist to now they're, the robotic people in servitude to this autocratic dictator named Putin. And Putin is Stalin-like with his visage everywhere, staring down. He controls everything. He controls American elections. Apparently, he can tell me how to vote. That's how powerful this guy is. The only way we are going to learn to live in peaceful harmony with the world is to learn to respect the world. Right now, we don't respect the world. We don't even ask the world to respect us. We just want the world to fear us. That's all. You must do what we tell you to do. We'll pretend to be your friend, but ask Germany how that worked out. Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1. How'd that work out, Germany? Ask Angela Merkel, how does it be the friend of Barack Obama, knowing now that he ordered your phone calls intercepted? Ask any American ally what it means to be the friend of the United States. I think the French are very happy with us right now because we're their friends. And of course, we sell them liquid natural gas at a very reasonable rate. Or do we? My point is, America's a friend to nobody. Mm-hmm. All we want and all we demand is that you be subservient to us. And until that relationship changes, until we learn how to be good neighbors, neighbors that respect not only the dignity of others, but the equality of others, that it's not a superior versus a subordinate, it is equals. And until America learns how to live as an equal player in a world a multipolar world populated by equals, there will be no peace and harmony. And frankly speaking, right now, the American people aren't up to that. We're not wired that way. It's a generational problem. It's going to take time. Sure, I do believe eventually we'll get there, but it's not going to be my generation. We're broken. Probably not going to be the generation of my children because many of them are broken. It might be their children or their children after that will eventually, it's like racism in America. We had to have multiple generations, go through multiple generations just to erase some of the ugliness of our slave-owning past. But even today, it's not perfect. Racism's still here. We have more generations that we need to cycle through before we can say that this is eradicated, if it ever can be eradicated. How do you tell a nation that believes that we have a manifest destiny given to us by God Almighty to control the world, that it is God's destiny? And I'm not joking. We truly believe this. Why do we always keep saying, God bless America? What does that mean? that God doesn't bless the rest of the world? Just God blesses America? Our God-given rights only to us? God only gave them to us. He reached out. We're the chosen people now. I mean, America's hubris is stunning. And until we stop viewing ourselves as the exceptional people and start viewing ourselves as just another person, there isn't going to be peace and harmony.
Scott Ritter, thank you for your insights, sir.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.